and the belief that it's always in equilibrium, or pretty damn close, and it doesn't have banks, doesn't have debt, and doesn't have money, which are all absolutely insane assumptions that dominate conventional economic theory. So I'm built a method for simply build models that are strictly monetary. You can have banks inside there, financial transactions, shadow banking, whatever you can model, you can put in there. It's dynamic, it's non-equilibrium, and it's a closer way of getting a lens to looking how the economy actually operates than the stuff which has dominated economics and meant they didn't see this crisis coming, and they don't know why we're still slowly dragging away out of it.
So the Minsky, Hyman Minsky, of course, the economist, one of his postulates is that you've got a rising bubble in an economy where the bubble assets are used as collateral to finance more leverage to increase the bubble until such time as the bubble bursts. But all throughout the building up of the bubble, people are convinced that, as Alan Greenspan said in the 1990s, there's a new paradigm. They're smoking their own belly button lint. They are getting high on the high prices.
You must try that sometime.
Until there's a collapse. So this Minsky machine is going to capture the irrationality of markets.
It makes it possible to capture it. You can model actually virtually any system you like, and you can model the weather. It's using exactly the same basic technology that engineers have developed over the last 30 years, programs like Simulink and VisSim and VenSim and Stellar that engineers would be aware of. But economists have never gone in that dynamic direction. So I'm giving that as a tool. It's not actually, it doesn't encapsulate Minsky, but it lets me express Minsky and lets people build any model as long as it's dynamic and it's monetary. And I think once you do that, you'll get all the stuff Minsky was talking about, because in a fundamental way, Minsky had an accurate vision of the real world, but you can't express that vision unless you escape from equilibrium and unless you accept that the system is fundamentally monetary. Once you do that, I think Minsky stuff will turn up automatically, but Austrians could use it. Anybody except strict neoclassicals can use it because they believe in a fairyland.
So if somebody wants to contribute to the project, they go to Kickstarter?
Yeah, go to Kickstarter. It's very simple. If you've bought a book from Amazon, you're ready to contribute. You simply say you want to make a pledge, choose the amount, the reward you want, whatever. You can do more than any amount if you want to give it in a particular reward. Click in, next thing you know, you're in Amazon's page, you make the pledge and you're back in Kickstarter again. It's extremely simple.
All right, Steve Kane, you've brought along some chart porn for us to look at. This is a chart of margin debt to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So what's it telling you?
Yeah, well, I've been trying for a long time to find margin debt because I know that the driving force for any asset bubble is the acceleration of the debt that finances it. And if you take a look at the correlation of the acceleration in margin debt to the change in the Dow Jones, it ain't quite perfect, but it's too damn close for comfort. What it tells you is any stock market bubble is driven by accelerating debt. And because accelerating debt can't go on forever, at some point that bubble has to burst. And looking at it, the Dow's definitely in a bubble now, and it might last a year, maybe two, but it's going to burst.
Well, this sounds like a Minsky moment is being developed right now with all this incredible debt. You know, when the market froze in 2008, a lot of people had hoped that maybe they would instigate some kind of bank reform and put some bankers in jail who had abused the system, who had manipulated the markets. But instead, the response of Greenspan and Bernanke, of course, his successor, was to just pump up the bubble again.
Yeah, they've tried to rescue the past. This is a human failing. I won't totally crucify Greenspan and co for doing it because they're behaving like all the fools in the past who thought they could go back and continue an unsustainable trend. The Mayans, the Easter Islanders, the works. They kept on going until the last tree. We're doing the same thing here. Rather than saying we need to change and learning a lesson, they're saying we've got to rescue what used to happen in the past and let it all start happening again. Once we do that, the crisis is over. You've just kicked the crisis further down the road.
How will the lesson, Professor, be learned that by making this money artificially cheap, you're making, let's say, natural resources artificially scarce?
Yeah.
You're making risk artificially cheap. In other words, when these hedge funds and these money managers are buying into this bubble, a Warren Buffett, for example, buying into this bubble, they're just taking advantage of a situation that is depriving the vast majority of the population of a decent savings rate, a decent wage. But why can't there be any educational process to try to have people come to terms with the fact that you're feeding a model that is either the divine right of kings or a slave model, but it's not about a representational, democratic, free market system anymore?
Nothing like it. It's something which is actually Ponzi capitalism.
Ponzi capitalism.
And we've let that take over the system in the last 40 years. And because it's become what we've always had as our background, we think it's normal. But people will look at us in half a millennium and say, how do these people not see it? It's predatory capitalism. It's not productive capitalism. We need to get back to the 1950s America, where when you borrowed money it was to build a factory or to invent some new technology, not to build a bloody derivative and rip people off in the process and mythically call yourself wealthy and an investor.
All right, we mentioned Alan Greenspan. He's quoted recently as saying the stock market is really the key player in the game of economic growth. So it's almost like, I don't know, Plato's cave or something, where he's looking at the shadow of growth, that being a stock price, and claiming that's the reality, even though that reality that he claims is the only thing to look at as the indicator of how we're doing, is the very thing that's undermining and causing incredible duress and stress and unemployment and ecological collapse.
The real problem is they talk about rising asset prices, houses and stocks, as being what they call the wealth effect. It's not the wealth effect, it's the leverage effect. It's driving up the gap between consumer prices and asset prices with extra debt. So what they're picking as the path of the economy is the path of change in debt. Now the change in debt can also drive demand on the real economy. So you get a correlation between the two. But he's seeing the stock market as the cause of the change in wealth. In fact, changing debt is what drives the asset market and also pumps the economy up for a while. But as we've seen, it can be an artificial pump and it collapses later. We need to get back to the productive economy, not the rip-off economy that people like Greenspan have promoted.
Now, Steve Keen, we're here on the west side of Manhattan, over on the far west side, and looking east just a couple of blocks. The viewers can't see it, but I can see it. I can see the headquarters of the New York Times. And of course, in that building occasionally would walk Paul Krugman, their economics editor. Now, Paul Krugman is a guy who believes that there should be no real supply and demand economics. There should be no integrity in the banking system. There should only be money printing until the cows come home, and using the stock market as a guide for success. How come this guy it gets away with such intellectually dishonest editorials? Shouldn't there be a Nuremberg trial for someone like Krugman for perpetrating the financial holocaust that he is?
You and I are going to be on different sides of this to some extent, because Krugman is talking about the delusions that come not from the east side of this river, but down Chicago, and the delusional idiots down there are Chicago economists. They're the people he actually thinks are his main enemy, and they're the ones he's fighting. And compared to them, he does make sense. Okay, and I agree with a lot of what he argues in terms of policy. At the moment, when you've got the private sector sucking money out of the economy, you don't want the government being a joint vampire in the process of taking cash flow out of the economy. So it does make sense in these circumstances. But intellectually, he's still wrong and shallow, because they still believe, and he's said it in print, in an argument with me, he said he's all for including banks in stories where they matter, but what's the role of banks in debt and leverage? Now that is so wrong. And so what he's perpetuating is a mythology that you can model capitalism without banks, debt and money. And that's where his negative contribution really is.
Yeah, but that's completely dishonest to Krugman, because he's saying essentially, oh, we can expand the balance sheet ad infinitum to stimulate the economy. And the problem are those guys in Chicago are taking all these derivatives in the Chicago School of Economics and the financialization of the world. But those are the guys who are hedging, supposedly, all the risk being taken by the central bank. There's a symbiotic relationship between what's happening in New York and Chicago, and by him claiming that, well, he supports one and not the other, is the sound of one hand clapping. This guy just wants it all. He's totally dishonest intellectually, and again, he should bear some responsibility for the catastrophe that the policies that he himself is being endorsing.
Well, way back in 2002, we argued that Greenspan should create a housing bubble to get us over the collapse of the dot-com bubble. So in that area, I'm going to agree with you. That's delusional. We don't need a bubble economy. We need a real production economy. But apart from that, his argument about needing the government to pump in cash when the private sector is taking it out is correct. So I'm going to disagree with you on that one, mate. But he is still, the problem is perpetuating an intellectually dishonest way of thinking about the economy. And that's why I've designed a program like Minsky, so people can look at the sort of stuff Krugman do and go, that's so old-fashioned, that's so intersecting lines equilibrium, that's nonsense. Let's get into dynamic thinking, and that completely inverts the way he thinks about the world. I don't believe he's dishonest, but I do believe he's wrong.
Okay, fair enough. I want to talk about Kickstarter for a second, because here you have an economic model that's relatively new, that relies on altruism to a large degree. But according to Ayn Rand, Kickstarter could never exist. Altruism doesn't exist. Altruism should be discouraged. So according to her, this company, Kickstarter, this movement of crowdfunding, which is now sweeping the globe, should be abolished because it supports altruism, and we can't possibly have that. Is Ayn Rand just a dope?
It's lunatic.
She's a lunatic.
We know much more about humanity now than she made back in the 50s. That's nonsense. Humanity's always been a combination of competition and altruism. Americans focus upon competition as though that's what made us strong. But if we were competing with animals on the African plains, we'd be wiped out by the nearest chimpanzee. He could tear you apart, he could tear me apart. Two of us together, we can take on the chimpanzee. So cooperation as well as competition is what made us strong as a species. Rand is mad to ignore that.
The cooperation versus competition.
Yeah.
Those two dynamics that drive economics and society in varying degrees.
Yeah.
Here in the United States, you're visiting this country, you'll notice that this idea of cooperation is considered to be communistic. For example, when Barack Obama would say, famously, "You didn't build that," I believe he said, referring to the fact that everybody in America is working together to create something called America, and that there is no everyone is standing on the shoulder of giants, to paraphrase another great philosopher. But how did they get to the point, in your opinion, as a visitor? You could be like to Tocqueville now, observing America as a visitor. How did the America psyche get to the point where the idea of cooperation itself became equated with everything that's evil in the world?
It's a good question. I think it relates back to had to relate back to the Cold War period and demonizing the other side, and believing that because the other side went for a total apparent cooperative system, the so-called cooperation of the Soviet Union, we had to be totally about competition. Now, they were wrong to be totally about cooperation and planning. America would be wrong to be totally about competition and lack of coordination. It's a symbiosis between the two. It's a yin and yang thing. Unless we get that right and see a balance there, we're going to produce an extreme society like the Soviet Union that collapsed and deserved to collapse, or an extreme society where you can't trust each other. You can't even park your car on the street. Now, you need to have a combination of the two. We need to get in the middle there and stop demonizing cooperation as much as the Russians had to stop demonizing competition. It's a blend of the two that makes a society strong. And America has got that in its history, and it should get back to it.